How do you bring a streamliner back to life? Today on the Roundhouse, we are going to find out from the folks at the Wisconsin Great Northern. All aboard!
In days past, the roundhouse was where the railroad worker united with the steam locomotive, each to prepare for the journey ahead. Today, it's where we examine the history, the industry, the machines, the hobby, and the passion behind railroading. News, interviews, stories, and more. So climb aboard. This is The Roundhouse.
Welcome to the Roundhouse. I'm your host, Nick Ozerak, and this is episode number 107 of our Trains and Railroading podcast, where we're talking about everything in the industry and the hobby, you name it, and we discuss it. Today, we are heading up to Wisconsin. We are talking to Robert Taburn and Nick Turinetti of the Wisconsin Great Northern Railroad. They are a tourist railroad that has some freight business, some car storage business, so we'll talk with them about how they balance these different elements of their business. They have all sorts of special events like their bed and breakfast train. But in particular, we're going to be talking about the Mark Twain Zephyr, a 1930s era streamlined passenger train set that the railroad is bringing back to operation. Before we get to that, though, I think it's safe to say I can announce that there will be new episodes of the Roundhouse every month, third Tuesday of the month. And I can say that because that's what I've been doing the past few months, and it seems sustainable. So that's what we're going with. Third Tuesday of every month, you can expect a new Roundhouse episode where you're naming it and we're discussing it. And I appreciate you guys being part of the conversation because this is just so much fun to have. And now that things are opening up once again, it means we get to have some great adventures together. And if you want to help support those adventures, patreon.com/the Roundhouse for as little as $1 a month. You're helping to support the Roundhouse podcast and what we're doing here. And I really appreciate that. Our guests today hail from the Wisconsin and Great Northern Railroad, which is a tourist outfit in the state of Wisconsin that is in the process of restoring the famous Mark Twain Zephyr. Please welcome to the Roundhouse the Director of Passenger Development, Robert Taburn, and Operations Manager, Nick Turinetti. How are you guys doing today?
Hey, good morning, Nick. Thanks for having us on.
Nice to be here.
What led to the formation of the Wisconsin Great Northern, and what is it, in essence?
Yeah, so I would start with a little bit of geography for people who maybe are familiar or not familiar with our area. So if you kind of picture Northwest Wisconsin, or maybe you got to get out your atlases, or maybe you've been up here before. If you took a big X and you put it over the northwestern portion of the state of Wisconsin, maybe going over to Minnesota a little bit. On one hand of the lower left-hand side of the X, you'd have the Twin Cities. On the lower right-hand side of the X, you'd have Eau Claire. On the upper left side, you'd have Duluth and the Twin Ports, and up on the upper right-hand side, you'd have Ashland, another port, of course, on Lake Superior. So you have this X over northwest Wisconsin, and that's roughly where the Chicago Northwestern built their rail lines back in the 1880s. And right at the crossing point of that X between those four major cities is Spooner, and that's where the Wisconsin Great Northern Railroad is headquartered, and we're just north of there in Trego, between Trego and Spooner. The rail lines were quite successful, especially the Twin Ports and the Twin Cities for the Chicago Northwestern. Of course, it was the history of the railroad was mostly under the Omaha, which of course is a subsidiary, but kind of kept its own name at least through the 1950s. A lot of lumber traffic. There's some passenger traffic, up to 18 passenger trains a day passed through Spooner back in the day. But things, of course, as we know, all railroads kind of lost steam after World War II in the 1950s and 1960s. And slowly little parts of the Omaha X were being abandoned, and then pretty large, sizable chunks as we passed into the 70s and 80s. And pretty much the whole thing would have been torn up, except when the line between Spooner and Hayward was going to be torn up in 1992. The residents of Spooner, Wisconsin, thought, you know, if you've ever been there, I think their high school is named after the trains. The local cafe is named after trains and has a train theme. And they didn't want to lose their connection, their 26-mile connection with Hayward, which is where what is now the Canadian National line between Duluth and Chicago goes, a very historic line. They didn't want to lose their rail connection kind of with the outside world. So they made some kind of deal with the state that gave them 5 years to leave the rail line in place before it would be torn up. And around the same time, our the owners of our railroad, truly is a mom and pop operation. Greg and Mardell Freeland were operating a dinner train up in Duluth, and they were looking to branch out and kind of do their own thing. And it just kind of timed out that this was their location to start service, and started up in 1997, which was um, the final year that really the line was could have been in place. If they waited a year or two or three more, the whole line would have been pretty much torn up. Definitely would have been torn up. So it was a great opportunity, and it saved this very important and historic rail line. So that's kind of what led to the formation of the Wisconsin Great Northern.
The line is saved. What is the development of both the tourist railroad and the freight traffic up to this point?
I'll talk a little bit about the tourist railroad, and then I'll throw it over to Nick, who can tell you a little bit more about the freight side of things. Um, this is a very unique, definitely a very unique tourist railroad line. I've ridden probably most of the ones in the country, and Wisconsin Great Northern is really unique. If you've never been up there, um, boy, I don't even know where to start. Well, the thing that's made it most unique is the bed and breakfast, which has really been that's started about 10 years ago, the service. But it's the only railroad bed and breakfast being offered in the country. So what people do is we have a dinner train and then also a bed and breakfast train. And what folks will do is we usually leave about board about 5, leave about 5:30. And for the dinner train, you're served dinner, and you go on a beautiful ride up to VZ Springs or beyond, which is in the actually one of two National Park Service units in Wisconsin, the St. Croix National Scenic Riverway. At 8 o'clock, if you're just on the dinner train, you disembark, go home, or go to your accommodations elsewhere. But the really unique thing is the folks who get to stay overnight, and you have accommodations, and we're switching to an all deluxe sleeper accommodations. We used to have the traditional bunks, like you'd experience like in an 11 bedroom sleeper, but we're moving in the direction of becoming really an all first class passenger operation. So we already have one car, the Namakogan Dreams, and there'll be other cars added, and with a full size queen bed in there. So two people, there's no bunks, there's no climbing in the upper bunks or anything like that. It turned out people enjoyed that even more than our business class car, which has the 3/4 size beds, or definitely the bunks, which we got rid of off that train. And you have to offer something unique. A lot of our folks drive from quite a distance. Milwaukee's 4.5 hours away. Chicago's 5.5 hours. Twin Cities is over 2 hours away. So you really do have to offer something unique. And then the way we're going is that when we do reopen post COVID, we'll be even more unique. So we'll have the bed and breakfast, but the folks on the dinner train, we're going to be offering, and I don't know, this is hasn't been released many places. Everybody's going to have a private dining experience. So even if you're one or two people, you'll actually have your own little dining room. We're converting our 4 articulated dining cars into 7 private diners per car, and you'll have your own little space. I'd say about the size of an Amtrak roomette or bedroom, with a booth and a table. And so we've never forced anybody to eat together like you do on Amtrak on the communal system of eating. We never did that. But now, on top of it, the bonus, you'll have your own private dining room to celebrate your anniversary, maybe your uh, birthday or whatever. So it's just becoming more and more unique. And of course, we'll get into the Zephyr, which will uh, be very unique. And I think we're also going to talk about our Pacific Parlor car. So we'll get into more of those pieces of equipment, which also make the railroad unique.
And Nick, what is the freight operation looking like at this point?
Well, to be perfectly honest, since St. Patrick's Day of last year, freight is the only operation that we've had on the railroad. Because obviously, when you're offering an experience where people stay overnight, or people are, the main attraction that we have for people is first class dining experiences. It's hard to offer that in a way that meets our goals and expectations when everybody has to wear a mask, or we weren't even permitted to do it because people had to social distance. So essentially, there's 3 legs to how the WGN makes its money. And the 3 legs are the passenger side, which Robert talked about. We do car storage, and car storage is actually the first aspect beyond the train rides that we offered. That started back in about 2009, and it's actually grown to be a quite substantial portion of how we make a living. I think right now we have upwards of 1,000 cars online, and what really makes us unique in regards to car storage is that we are very much customer orientated. So if a customer calls up and says, I need to have 30 cars, when can you get them to me? It's not uncommon for other car storage operations that might say, well, between digging it all out and our other business, it might take us a month or 45 days. There have been times where we've literally had the call come in on a Friday, and we've started pulling cars and switching the next Monday. And most recently time we did this, we actually moved every car on the railroad to get 30 cars for a customer who was looking for them back. And it does take a bit of work, but we also have, the skill and experience and the infrastructure in place that we can do that sort of thing. And that's, it's very unique in terms of the ability to offer that level of responsiveness in the car storage business. And it's obviously worked well for us because we are essentially to the point where we're almost full, and we have customers who are asking, can you take more? Can you take more? And that's getting into the realm of where we are seriously looking at having to expand the amount of trackage we have to be able to accommodate that business. The other aspect is actual freight, and the Wisconsin Great Northern, we're operating in a part of the state that is often called like sand country, because everything up here is sand, and sand doesn't work the best for trying to grow crops or doing anything like that. But it's really, really good at growing trees, especially pine trees. And so therefore, like, almost all of our freight business relates to the wood products industry. And it also goes along with our strong connection with Canadian National. Canadian National bought the lines that used to be the Wisconsin Central, and the Wisconsin Central bought from the Union Pacific back about 1996 or so, a little spur that ran underneath their main line up to Hayward. That was the only section of the Wisconsin Great Northern that was serving customers online. When all the things came together to, that formed, our current company. And what they essentially did is they found that it was kind of hard for them to serve because their nearest terminals are a substantial distance away. And Hayward has a Louisiana Pacific plant. There's a company that deals with high quality timber, and those two customers, required daily service. And what wound up happening is Canadian National approached us, and we finally worked out a deal to basically take over operation of that little section of track from Hayward that directly connects with us at a point called Hayward Junction. It's about 6 miles. And then south from there is our trackage all the way down to Spooner. So we have a crew that works 5 days a week, serving Louisiana Pacific, and their the main thing they make out of there is like OSB, which is a form of plywood or plywood like material for construction, and they also do siding, like building siding. And then our partnership with Canadian National also enabled us to pick up another couple customers when they decided that they wanted to close a log landing that they owned a couple miles north of Hayward Junction. And what we wound up doing is working out an agreement where we just basically relocated the customers they had at the point's called Stanberry down to a point on our main line called Springbrook. And we actually wound up building a 2-track yard and log loading facility there. And so we had 4 customers. We've had some shakeups in the paper industry up here lately. So we're down to 1 customer at Springbrook and then the 2 at Hayward Junction. And, between those 3 shippers, we keep a crew busy 5 days a week, sometimes more if we have car storage cars coming in and out. So through a lot of determination and a lot of willingness to try and go, the extra mile, squeeze every last drop of potential revenue out of our resources, we've put together a way to keep ourselves afloat, even when 1/3 of our operation wasn't able to function and still hasn't been able to function since last year.
It's good to have a triangle because all of those markets, it seems to me, can fluctuate to some degree, at least. I mean, having a complete arm shut down because of COVID is an extreme. But it strikes me that with car storage, if there's a lot of rail traffic on the class 1s and cars are being pulled out of storage, then you have less going on there. Or as you've said, you have fluctuations in the paper market, then there may be less going on there. So it's good that if one arm is down, that you still have 2 arms that are pulling strong to diversify your income sources.
Yep. And honestly, the fact that we have as many cars online is essentially how we've been able to, keep a full crew employed in terms of being able to keep people working on other projects like the Zephyr, like the dining cars that Robert talked about. We our owners made the decision when this first came into play that they value a skilled workforce. It's not easy to find the people that you need for this type of work in our part of the country. So when you do find them, it's important to make sure that we do everything we can to keep them around and to keep them able to continue staying in the area even. So I don't think it was a difficult decision for them to make. I'm very grateful they made it, because I literally walked into my job now about a week and a half after the passenger side of things shut down. So even though I'm the operations manager, I've never physically overseen the operation of a passenger train on the WGN, which is a little unusual, but I've been through stranger things before. So
And then for me, I also recently started with the railroad. Was hired in October of 2019. Moved 300 miles up here from the South Milwaukee Racine area, and passenger development. My original position, and what I'll be getting back to, is developing new products and new services for the railroad. And but over the time, worked on a lot of other projects. We're all the full-time people at the railroad had been kept the whole time because of the car storage. So it was a little scary, honestly, personally moving up here and literally 10 weeks after starting the job as director of passenger development, all this happened and the passenger operations have stopped. But working on a lot of other projects, pretty much we've written two and what will be three long books about the history of the Mark Twain Zephyr. So one of my projects has been becoming the de facto historian of some of our equipment, and actually working on another book right now that will cover the history of all 50 some rail cars that we have on property. So I become the de facto historian, and Nick has become the head of the work crews out there.
Before we get into the Zephyr, which is obviously the particular crown jewel of historic passenger equipment, what are some of the cars that you have in operation at present, as well as some of the ones that you're looking to bring online, including, to my own personal curiosity, the Pacific Parlor car?
Yeah, the Pacific Parlor car is definitely a crown jewel. Um, as I don't know if everybody knows much of the history of that, but they were Santa Fe when they designed the El Capitan in 1954. The Santa Fe um, between 1954 and 1956, they wanted to develop a special lounge, so they had six of these high-level lounge cars built, which was enough for one spare and five to be on the road between Chicago and Los Angeles via Albuquerque, roughly the Southwest Chief route today. And they used these cars up until 1971, and then Amtrak took it over. Of course, it became the Southwest Limited then, and then the Southwest Chief, and then used in other routes through the 80s. And as the superliners came online, they didn't need the cars as much. They were older. People preferred the larger windows in the superliner sightseer lounge cars. And they were about 1994, 1995, they were in danger of being scrapped down at Beech Grove. They were all collected and sent down to Beech Grove outside Indianapolis for scrapping. And Amtrak had a executive who was in charge of the Western long distance trains, specifically the Coast Starlight. His name was Brian Rosenwald, and Brian had just a wonderful, idealistic, wonderful way of looking at passenger service, thinking that, for people to pay the sleeping car prices, they deserve some kind of special amenities and some kind of special treatment that maybe they weren't getting. And so he thought, well, we're going to take five of the six Pacific Parlor cars and refurbish them and add them on as a parlor car, which something Amtrak really didn't have up until that time. A special, basically a first class lounge car just for sleeping car passengers. And he, of course, picked the Coast Starlight, which was a beautiful route if you've ever, hopefully, you've had a chance to take it. But yeah, it goes right up along the coast. You could almost take a stone from the train and throw it into the ocean, down near San Luis Obispo, up along the coast, Vandenberg Air Force Base, and then the next day you go through the Cascade Mountains, and as you come into Seattle, you're right along the Puget Sound, and it's just a beautiful route, scenery nonstop, perfect to have this car on. And from 1996 all the way until February 4th of 2018, Amtrak had the car on. It did experience a lot of mechanical problems. It was an old car. A lot of the superliner parts didn't fit. A lot of the parts on the car had to be custom made. So the decision was made by Amtrak management, of course, within only a 2-week notice, that they were going to be pulling the cars and then auctioning them off. And I have a personal connection to the car, the one that is actually at the Wisconsin Great Northern, 39972 Napa Valley, was the one on the July 11th, 1956 premier train of the high level equipment. And my father, who was 19 at the time, actually was on that train with my grandfather. So, and that was the car that was used, the one at the Wisconsin Great Northern. And I knew Greg, the owner of our railroad, for several years. We'd go to Train Fest and Mad City Rail. We'd run into each other, and he called me up about July of 2019, and he said, "Guess what? I won the auction for one of the parlor cars." And I thought they would end up somewhere in California, maybe at the California State Railroad Museum. I wasn't in on the whole auction process. I don't know who decided where all the uh, cars would end up. Of course, of the six of them, one is unrefurbished and down in a rail yard outside of St. Louis. Um, the other cars, two went to the Owasso Steam Institute in Owasso, Michigan. I got to ride on they ran them in December of 2019 on their Christmas train. And then the two others went to I believe, Dallas Terminal Railroad, John's Trains, a private individual down in Dallas area who supplies some of the cars for the Galveston Christmas train. So I was very shocked. Got the chance to come up and ride in Wisconsin. Saw what a wonderful job that the Wisconsin Great Northern honestly did with the cheese and wine train, which is what they used the car for about 3 months in December of 2019. And it reminded me exactly of the service level that Brian Rosenwald instituted back on these parlor cars in 1996 with the cheese and the wine and the fruit and the level of service. Amazingly, the Wisconsin Great Northern was able to replicate this experience that Amtrak provided in the early days, when Amtrak actually seemed to care about the service and the cheese and wine the way it was designed to be. Wisconsin Great Northern replicated the experience identically, and passengers had such great time. And the 3 months the car operated pre-COVID, the cheese and wine was sold out weeks and weeks in advance. And so once we come back online, we're going to look at expanding the car, using it up to six days a week potentially, and adding maybe even luncheon service to it.
That'll be really impressive to see what that looks like in regular operation. Now, Nick, you said that you haven't yet experienced passenger operations on this railroad yet, but you do have a background in that. So what is the mentality that you bring to how to balance freight and passenger operations once you guys are ready to begin that dual operation?
Well, to a certain extent, we do have the benefit that where our passenger trains operate and where the bulk of our freight service is located don't interfere with one another. All of our freight customers are on the north half of the railroad, and our current operating base is from our depot just south of Trigo. And most of our storage cars are south of that point. We have a couple miles in between the two that sort of serve as a nice buffer. So it's not inherently difficult to kind of keep the two apart from one another and keep one in one place, one in the other. My experience prior to this was working for a railroad museum that had an operating arm. And the biggest difference that I can see just from looking on the ground is that the Wisconsin Great Northern has a goal that they're well on their way to basically having a train for every different service, as opposed to trying to reuse all of the same equipment to do a multitude of different things. Like Robert alluded to, we have two sets of articulated dining cars. They were originally built for the Southern Pacific as part of their daylight, or Shasta daylight service. They've been rebuilt a couple times. They're excellent in terms of the ability to host a large number of people if you need to, and even with private dining as opposed to open table dining, they're a great option there. One of the other unique pieces of equipment we have is what we refer to as the Doodlebug, and it's actually a Robert, you can probably correct me on this, but it's a former interurban car that was rebuilt with a diesel hydraulic system. And what it's set up as right now is like a little table car. It's got tables and chairs inside of it, And that's what we use routinely when we have, a regular sightseeing excursion, which we run Tuesdays through Saturdays during most of the summer months. It's perfect for any group of people below, 30, and it's perfect for the quick run out to VZ Springs and back. We have a whole train's worth of like heavyweight passenger cars. They have open windows. They also have air conditioning. They have heat. Those are probably our next project coming down the line in terms of giving them a little bit of a refurbishment. But that's an option. We've got several different types of sleepers on the railroad for different services. We've obviously, like Robert said, moved towards deluxe first class options because that's where people seem to have the most interest. And it's part of being a for-profit railroad is that you go where the market kind of says that you need to go. So when it comes down to the actual operations, when we restart those, I'm looking forward to it from the perspective that I have a train ready to go for every sort of service we're going to offer. I don't have to have a train come back and try and scramble to switch out, cars that don't belong in the evening dinner train or put cars on that are supposed to be there, trying making sure that they're clean, from the day before their last use. The ultimate goal here is to eventually have, a yard set up where every train is stacked ready to go, and as each one comes back in, you just line a switch, pull it in, the cleaners go to work, the next train pulls up, and your next offering is ready to roll.
Of course, one train set that even if you wanted to switch out the cars, you couldn't because they are permanently coupled to one another is the Mark Twain Zephyr. Robert, Luke Solberg asks, how did the Wisconsin Great Northern get the opportunity to purchase this set? So now it seems like a good time to just go over the history of the train set as a whole.
Yeah, well, thanks, Luke Solberg, for sending that excellent question in, and we'll back up and give you a little bit of the history too. Um, had a lot of chance to research this as I mentioned. My position changed a little bit because of COVID, and our owners were really wonderful in giving me the time, probably about 8 months of time to dig and delve into the history of it, and it's been a really cool project. I got to interview several of the former children of the original owners. Got to visit them, but basically, of course, the first Zephyr we all know is the Pioneer Zephyr, and that is at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, and was kind of the first Zephyr to prove that, hey, yeah, we can do it. And then next, the second and third Zephyr, of course, were the Twin Zephyrs on the very busy route. And then I don't know. I always kind of think of Mark Twain Zephyr as kind of the scrappy, the scrappy kind of plane train. But it was kind of interesting um, that it was created for that route because it really wasn't a very busy passenger route. Um, and it wasn't as fancy as the Denver Zephyr, which came later. But it was built in 1935, of course, after the Pioneer Zephyr and the Twin Zephyr. So it was really the fourth shovel nose to come about, and it was inaugurated on October 25th, 1935. And then, of course, it was supposed to run from Burlington, Iowa, down through Hannibal. Of course, that's the Mark Twain connection, and then to run down to St. Louis. What's kind of interesting, we found out, a lot of people thought it ran the whole time for the 23 years that it ran on the Burlington, it ran on that route. But what we found was the Burlington was constantly pulling it out of service of the original route, putting it on other routes, and then it would come back to the route for a few years or even a few months, and then it would be pulled for some different service. Not even a year after being inaugurated, it and the Pioneer Zephyr were pulled out of service and ran from Chicago to Denver in 1936 as the Advanced Denver Zephyrs. before the real Denver Zephyrs, the equipment was put into service. And then for other years, it ran on the route of the Ozark State Zephyr between Kansas City and St. Louis, and different routes. For 2 weeks, it actually ran through Wisconsin and Minnesota, and filled in for one of the Pioneer Zephyrs in December of 1936. So it was kind of interesting. In its later career, it kind of did return more to the original route of Burlington to St. Louis. And it was finally pulled out of service in 1958, April of 1958. And then it was put up for sale. And one of the other interesting things that was going on during the same period was that the Pioneer Zephyr was also pulled out of service around the same time. And the Pioneer Zephyr, if you've of course been to the Museum of Science and Industry, you'll notice that it is 3 cars. Well, for most of its life, it was 4 cars, but the Science and Industry Museum in Chicago did not have room for the dining car, car 500, which was added a couple of years after the Pioneer Zephyr was created. So it actually got lobbed in with the Mark Twain Zephyr train set when the Mark Twain Zephyr was sold to its first private owner, Frank Dashner. And there's a lot of history. There was 7 different private owners over the course of the year, over the course of 60 years, which maybe a lot of people don't know. And we've written a book. If anybody is interested in the history, we have a 2-volume series and what will become a 3-volume series that traces its history. So if anybody's interested, it's available at www.mtz, like Mark Twain Zephyr, store.com. And it's sold by the railroad, written by my wife and I, and a couple other co-authors, and it's sold by the railroad with the sales going toward the restoration of the train. And but there's really some interesting stories, and I'll tell you a few, and then if you're interested, you'll have to check out the book. But shortly after it was purchased from the Burlington, the first owner, Frank Dashner, he lived in a little town of Glenwood, Iowa, which was outside Omaha. And he had this grand plan, and they called him the ultimate flipper, is what his daughter and his son, who are now in their 80s, said. Oh, Dad was an ultimate flipper. He wanted to sell the train, refurbish it, and sell it to Cuba and the government of Cuba. And it turned out, of course, Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution, and it actually went all the way up to President John F. Kennedy, who said, no, the United States will not sell a train to our enemies in Cuba. So there's a lot of interesting stories along the way. A lot of people, some of the owners said this was a project we wanted to take on, and maybe have some beers on the weekend, scrape some paint, refurbish a train. I don't know if they didn't realize how much work it is, because we've had a full-time crew of 6, 7, 8 people working on it for the last 9 months. But other projects where it was supposed to be back in 1987, there was a proposal to turn it into the Coors Light, the Silver Bullet train for beer. Proposal fell through. It was supposed to be a casino train. Proposal fell through. So there were a lot of different owners who had a lot of different ideas for this train, and it just never came to fruition. Before the most recent owners kept it at a railroad yard outside of St. Louis, and it kind of just sat up against the fence from 2012 on. And the owners of our railroad have purchased a lot of equipment from this rail yard outside of St. Louis. And every time our owners would go down, they would see this I mean, it literally was a shell. It was a shell of equipment sitting up against the fence as you entered the rail yard. So every time they would go there from 2012 on, the last 7, 8, 9 years, they would see this and, you think that's something we could do? And they kind of keep it at the back of the head, and the project kind of took shape in our owner's head. Every time he kind of saw this, he bought checked out another piece of equipment for the Wisconsin Great Northern. I think this is something we'd really like to do, and really the he's planning for really the last decade, and it just kind of came to fruition over the last couple years. He was actually going to purchase it in 2019, but the Pacific Parlor car came up for sale. So the plan got delayed until February 17th of 2020 when we um, went down with Greg and his now 11-year-old son Alexander, and they wrote the check and made the first payment on it. And it's just stunned me how, people tried to do something with this for over 60 years, not been able to do it, and just the incredible work of uh, the last 9 months. Just went on the car yesterday, and the glasses in the bar car, the spare car which I was mentioning, which was nicknamed Effie Dean by the previous owners, and it's the bar's in. I was there on Tuesday, and there was nothing there, and now the bar's in, and the windows are in, and all the trim around. It's like, I come up about 2 days a week to film and do social media projects and things like that, and it's like I come up on Tuesday, and then I come back on Friday, and it's like, how did you guys do all this in like 3 days? And look at all the stuff I missed. So it's been incredible.
From the progress that we've seen shared online, it really is quite the transformation, even up to this point here in May of 2021. Nick, perhaps you could provide us an overview of the shape the train set was in when it came onto the property and what overall is required to put it back into operation.
Well, as Robert kind of alluded to, when it got here, there was honestly not much. The Zephyr had been, several of the previous owners had, put forth ideas about doing different things with it, and whether by, their hand or simply just the hand of time getting in and, causing decay on, the parts of the train that can decay. There was really just the stainless steel shell, and in some places you had a little bit of the roof of the interior ceiling left, or some of the side panels. Essentially, what we wound up with when it got here was a blank slate, and for a lot of places, that might have had the idea of restoring this train, as it was exactly when it was built. That would be a major hurdle. I mean, you're talking about fabricating seats, light fixtures, baggage racks, all of these things that people, assume and we know was in the car from scratch. And, or maybe if you're lucky, being able to go down to the Museum of Science and Industry and like measuring and photographing what's in the Pioneer, and then going and trying to find somebody to fabricate that for you. So the fact that it showed up as a blank slate was actually a benefit to us, because as Robert alluded to, he's here 2 days a week, and you can see a phenomenal change in the 3 days between when he's here once and when he's here next time. When you've worked for the Wisconsin Great Northern for a little while, that's actually not all that surprising, because almost every piece of rail equipment that we operate right now came to us in a similar state, or was so far decayed that we had to take it to about the state that the Zephyr was in when it got here before we start work. So from our perspective, you get handed a train that's basically a skeleton. Well, that's great. The hard stuff's already done. All we have to do is start building up what's going to be inside of the train. And interior work, obviously, is something that we've had a lot of experience doing. We have a lot of people who are very skilled and familiar with things like, installing insulation, wiring, all of that, interior finishing. So that's part of how it's progressed as fast as it has, is that, this isn't our first rodeo. Where it gets a little bit more complicated is into like the actual mechanicals of like the trucks, the air brake system, the prime mover, and things like that. And again, we're looking at a locomotive and a train set that has not really been maintained in a capacity where it could operate since about 1958. And in all probability, the Burlington had seen the writing on the wall for a few years prior to that and probably didn't put a whole lot of money into keeping the train in top form for several years prior to that. So between its various owners and between sitting outside for 60 years, what I've focused my attention on for the most part has been working on disassembling the trucks that sit underneath each one of the cars. And when you look at them, it's very obvious that they've had a hard life outside. That there are things that are so rusted we've had to torch them off simply because there's no way to try and break loose, the nuts and pins and bolts that are holding it. And part of that comes from the car. The trucks haven't been under the train the entire time. Sometimes they were stored separately, and at least in one instance, they were in a location that they were entirely underwater several times over the course of several years. So from that perspective, I've had to do a lot of work to just make sure the trucks come apart in such a way that we can get to the point of ultrasonic testing them, sandblasting them, fixing any cracks, and getting towards reassembly. And where I'm at right now with that is I've essentially finished disassembling everything I can that I can handle by myself or with another person. We're to the point where we're going to start needing, cranes and other machinery to start the final disassembly and get to that crack testing phase and sandblasting, painting, things like that. So there's no shortage of things that actually have to be done to this train to get it operational. The one benefit is that we're working with a train that's stainless steel, and as we've found, as we've gone through the cleanup and rebuilding, Bud built this thing to last. Its body itself is actually in really, really good shape. So much so that at times when we've been going through the cars, you can actually still see some of the marks that were put on the structural components in the factory. There are some notes on some of the structural members that were put there by the people who assembled it in 1935. It's held up that well.
You talk about having a train set for every purpose. Once this is back in operation, what is the designated purpose of this train set?
Well, some of that is kind of still in flux. Is that, obviously the Mark Twain Zephyr by itself is an attraction. It's a little bit of the field of dreams, build it and they will come. The same concept that Robert mentioned. We have to offer first class service to bring people to Trigo, Wisconsin. There's not a huge local base of potential riders. We do have the benefit of being on, a major highway, but at the same time, there's not a whole lot of destinations in our immediate area. People are kind of passing through instead of being there to ride the train. So we have to give them a reason to come up and ride. And in that sense, the Mark Twain Zephyr fits in that concept very well. It's offering an all first class experience, bringing people to ride it. But the nice thing about it too is that we also don't have to be locked into any one specific use for it. We can kind of judge what the interest is and adapt accordingly.
Rob, this question's for you. So the Mark Twain Zephyr is a 4-car set essentially, and each piece of equipment in the train set was named for a character in The Adventures of Tom Sawyer by, of course, Mark Twain. So you've got Tom Sawyer, which is the observation end car. You have a car named Huck Finn. The power car is named Injun Joe, spelled I-N-J-U-N, not engine like train engine. That is the character's name in the book, but it's largely agreed upon in this day and age that term is very offensive towards Native American people. So on the one hand, you have this term that is historically appropriate for the train because that's what it was called, and it was named after the book, but it's now a very problematic word today. Do you intend to change the name? And if not, how do you intend to interpret the history in a way that contextualizes the use of that term?
Yeah, it's definitely something that has been brought up. I've seen comments on social media, and at this point, and kind of in another name that we have also that I'm gonna kind of that has also been brought up, not considered offensive necessarily, but some another part of our car is that we have the car from the Pioneer Zephyr. The previous owners have also named it Effie Dean, which of course the Pioneer Zephyr never had names on their cars. So we've had some people say, "Well, what are you going to do with Engine Joe?" And then also, what are you going to do with Effie Dean, because it's not the original name? Are you going to keep the name on the card? It honors the wife of Albert Dean, who is one of the creators of the Zephyr. So at this time, it's we're focusing mostly on the restoration, and then as the restoration comes to an end, and then things are decided, and new nameplates are possibly made. That's when the decision on what to do with that. There's been talk. I know Nick and I were chatting about it yesterday. Some people have come up and said, "Well, how about if you just change it to Engine Joe, Engine?" So I don't know. What do you think, Nick?
I mean, we know fairly consistent. We're pretty certain that the Burlington, named the power unit as they did purposely. It's intended to be a little bit of a pun, and they just had the benefit of Mark Twain having a character who was very close to engine in his name. Um, I think the biggest thing is that, and this is kind of speaking more from a personal perspective again, because a final decision has not been made. Um, I don't think there's any benefit in trying to pretend it wasn't named this. It's it the train and its names are a product of history. We can't undo history. The best we can do is basically acknowledge it happened, and not try to pretend it didn't happen. And the example I can think of that kind of comes close to this in preservation is, I know there are a couple railroad museums in the South that have preserved Jim Crow cars, and they have, for the most part, have not tried to alter them. They've basically said there was a time in this country where these cars were exactly as you see them, and we can't change that. This is just how they are. That doesn't mean that in this day and age we understand them the same way as they were then. And it's a discussion we'll still have to have and make a final decision on. That's just essentially my personal take on it.
One thing that came up as a recurring question, speaking of the discussion around the train set, when I put the call out to you guys to submit questions for this conversation we're having today, I think the most popular question, and chose Craig Sanders' phrasing of it, what power plant will be used?
Yes. This is like a perennial. I've almost gotten this memorized in terms of how to answer this, because it comes up so frequently. Just as a little bit of background for anyone who's not familiar, most of the Zephyrs, when they were built, had a prime mover, what provides the power to actually generate electricity and run the train, was a Winton 201A engine. And though 201A was an 8-cylinder engine, it's sort of like the grandfather of EMD's very successful line of 567 engines. And the benefit or the problem, depending on your point of view, is that the Mark Twain Zephyr's 201A is not in it. It's been gone for probably the better part of 20 years, maybe more. So whether or not we wanted to, we have to find a different prime mover. And you only have to go and ask the guys who are in charge of, or were in charge of restoring the Flying Yankee about the challenges that are associated with trying to make a 201A operational, not just one time, but consistently and reliably for the indefinite future. Our goal is to have a piece of equipment that, is easy to repair, is reliable, that we can count on being ready to go at the drop of a hat if we need it to be. And because of that, we have elected to put a more modern engine into the engine, Joe. And the one that we've selected is a 6-cylinder 567C. And what this basically means is a 6-cylinder engine as opposed to an 8-cylinder engine. It's a little bit shorter, a little bit wider, and a bit taller than the 201A was. And one of the things that we're doing actually right now is we have crews in the engine room of the power unit. They're actually modifying the mounts on the floor so that the prime mover is ready to drop in when we get to that point. One of the things that, and I know people have come back and before and said, well, why are you doing this? I laid it out a little bit, but one of the other things to keep in mind too is that, the Zephyrs themselves were actually retired a little early compared to what they could have. They were in a physical shape. They probably could have kept running for a while longer. One of the factors in their retirement was probably the fact that the 201A was, becoming more difficult to keep in service. And if you look at what was going on in diesel manufacture at the time they were retired, if instead of deciding to, pull them from service, the Burlington had decided to try and re-engine them with a more modern and more reliable prime mover, they almost certainly would have chosen the 6567C because it does fit with very little modification needed.
Because this is an operational set, it does mean that there is finding a balance between making it historically accurate, or what is believed to be historically accurate and functional. And Eric Kapusta writes, do your plans call for everything to be authentic, or will there be modern appliances for both comfort and safety?
Yeah, that's a good question from Eric. And so the first thing that is important to remember is, which is a little bit different. If you look at the there's 3 other shovel noses, I believe, that are currently in existence. Of course, the Pioneer Zephyr, and in Chicago, the 9900. We have the Mark Twain Zephyr, and the only other Zephyr is, of course, the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, the 9908, the Pershing Zephyr, and then of course you have the Flying Yankee. But focusing on the 2 other Burlington engines, they're in railroad museums. They're in, or just museums, the Science and Industry in Chicago and the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis. Um, as we're always told to keep in mind, we're not a railroad museum. And that's an important thing for people to keep in mind, is we're not Science and Industry, we're not Illinois Railroad Museum, we're not Sacramento. We are a working for-profit, family-owned and operated railroad. So you could take something like, let's say, the Becky Thatcher, which has been one of my projects I've been working hard on. You could leave it an empty baggage car, I guess. We've decided to turn it into a display car that will walk everybody through you'll come in from the Effie Dean, the Tavern Car 500. You'll walk through, and you'll start at 1932 basically on the timeline. You'll walk through the Becky Thatcher, and you'll learn all about the different Zephyrs, and then you'll actually go into the engine in the back, what was the RPO, and we're gonna have a theater where you get to come in and watch some video clips of the old Zephyrs. And then you'll come back and do the second half of the museum, which talks about the Mark Twain construction and then its move to Trigo, and then finally the last couple panels will be the ribbon cutting and the dedication and everything. So I guess if you want to be historically accurate, you could leave the baggage car completely empty, and I guess you could kind of reconstruct an RPO. But how I look at it with those two cars, at least, I think it'd be a lot more interesting for passengers to walk through the baggage car instead of having an empty car, to learn about the Zephyrs. And then, a lot of RPOs have been reconstructed. Most people kind of know what they look like. But to come in and actually be in the engine and to sit and watch some films and video clips of the old Zephyrs coming and going or whatever, if we decide to do presentations in there or whatever, you kind of balance that as yeah, I guess accurate, or we could add some kind of modern amenities and kind of do that. And I know, Nick, we were talking yesterday about the two passenger cars and the thoughts on that.
Yeah, and I guess one of the other things to go back to is Robert alluded to it a bit earlier, is that when it was built, the Mark Twain Zephyr was not, on the whole, a intended as to be a super prestigious train. Of all the Zephyrs built, it was actually pretty plain. All it had was, enough coach seating for about 75, 76 people.
Mm-hmm.
It had 16 parlor seats in the rear of the Tom Sawyer. You had the ability to serve light fare in, I think, to 8 people or so, or maybe 12 people in the dinette section. It was really sort of like the first Zephyr built that didn't have to be like top of the line. It was almost like, we've established the brand of the Zephyr through our first 3 trains. We want to improve service on this route through Hannibal. So let's just take what we're already doing and extend the brand to that. And where that comes into play for us is that, we really don't have the market. Our riders are not here just for a train ride in a coach seat. We actually have, quite a few regional choices in terms of train rides. There are 2 scenic railroad options up in Duluth. There's one to the west of us in Osceola. There's Mid-Continent down just north of Madison, Wisconsin, and all of those are within, a 1.5, 2 hour drive of us. They're, within 4 hours of each other. The way that we stand out, what makes us special, is our ability to offer, a first class accommodation and first class service. And with that in mind, that's kind of where we've taken the interior and appurtenances of the Mark Twain Zephyr. Greg said in a couple places before, we're going to try and give the train every little bit of Zephyr influence we can. And a lot of people, I think, have not taken that to mean, that what we're doing is actually drawing on the designs of other Zephyrs that were designed for first class service. We've drawn a lot from the designs of the Denver Zephyr, which was built the year after the Mark Twain Zephyr. That's been very influential in how the new configuration of the Tom Sawyer and the Huck Finn have been laid out. The tavern car in the Effie Dean is modeled after a similar car in the Denver Zephyrs consist, while also drawing on some of the concepts that we have in our other standard tavern car. So it's some people have taken it to mean that, when we say we're going to infuse it with Zephyr character, that we're going to go after the original Mark Twain Zephyr's character. And that's kind of not our direct goal, because it doesn't support, what we need to be able to do to serve the market that we've established.
Last question that I have for each of you is, what is most exciting about what lies ahead within the next year? There's finishing the train, there's getting back into operations. What aspect of those is most exciting? Starting with you, Rob.
To me, the most exciting thing is the fact that is the fact that I grew up in the Chicago area, and I saw the Pioneer Zephyr always in the science and industry, so I was very familiar with the shovel nose. And I also had the opportunity, like our owner did. I knew the owner of the railroad yard in St. Louis, and I also saw for 10 years this shell of the Mark Twain Zephyr sitting down in the yard with all the other passenger cars that they store there. And I looked at it kind of. I was looking at, not that I could afford it, but I was looking at it at the same time as the owner and owner of the Wisconsin Great Northern, and I just looked at it. I went in it a couple times, peeked in, and it's nothing but birds' nests and bees and pieces of the Forward Creek. And I it was just sad, because I said, well, I said, to myself, I said, at best, I said, maybe somebody will just do a uh, cosmetic exterior renovation that will be, probably not even that, but maybe the city of Quincy or Hannibal or some museum or something will buy this and just put fake windows in and just have the exterior sit out somewhere. And I thought that was going to be the best case scenario for this little shovel nose. And I said, well, that probably won't even happen. And and to sit there and think that this thing is actually going to run, and that I'm honored enough to work with the team and for the owners who valued this little piece of Zephyr that I always saw too when I would go down to this rail yard outside of St. Louis. And I think that this is actually going to run. um the other shovel noses are just in the museum, and they're pretty to look at. But I'm all about riding trains. I'm not a technical person like Nick and most of our crew. I'm not very handy. I'm good with history, and I like riding trains, and I love providing a first class experience for those who come and ride the trains. So I'm excited that to see it run, but also to see the look on the passengers' faces, and every day that we run this train, to make people happy. And I've got emails from um, I answer a lot of our emails off our websites, and people remember this. I got an email from like a 95-year-old guy and his wife, and they have pictures of them in the 40s they gave me, and we put up on our website of when the train came through. And he's like, I just hope I'm alive enough to be there to come up and ride it. And I said, well, we're working real hard to make that happen. And just to bring back memories and put smiles on our passengers' faces is the most important thing to me.
And I guess for me, when I look at the Mark Twain Zephyr, I'm going to be ecstatic when it is back in service, because it means I don't have to touch its trucks again for another 40 years. Um, but what I really look forward to is that the Mark Twain Zephyr is essentially the most. It's sort of like the top of the iceberg. It's the most visible part of an entire series of improvements and growth that the Wisconsin Great Northern is right on the cusp of. Something we haven't mentioned yet is that this year is the 25th anniversary of the Wisconsin Great Northern's creation, and that's been a big incentive with the Zephyr. It's still our hope that we can get the thing up and running and ready for people to come and see and ride during our 25th year. But more than that, the Zephyr is triggering a whole bunch of improvements on our property. We laid a whole new track in the yard specifically for it, because that's where it's going to live once it's back on its wheels. That also, was a factor in the rebuilding of 2.5 miles of railroad right around our depot too. We did a major track relocation project last year, with a crew of about 8 and a hydraulic high rail truck as our primary equipment doing it. Because of the fact that the Zephyr, is a complete train set, and you can back up with it, but it's really not set up for shoving operations. We're looking to basically build a pair of turning loops on the north end and the south end of its regular operating route. Those loops are another mile of track between the two of them we're going to build on brand new right of way. And they're also going to be of benefit to every other train we run, because we can go from having a out and back trip to a train ride where you see both sides of the railroads without ever having to leave your seat. The crews can go from one end of the railroad to the other and not have to worry about running around or doing air tests or anything like that. The Zephyr itself sort of is driving major growth across the entire company, and that's really exciting for me, because it means that we're going forward. And to be perfectly honest, part of the fact that part of me being employed by the Wisconsin Great Northern is directly related to the fact that the Zephyr was purchased. So I have a great appreciation for it, because it means I have a job.
It's fantastic that this project does serve as a beacon so that it catches people's attention, and then people get to see how much other interesting stuff that you have going on between your regular excursions and the bed and breakfast trains and so forth. The website to learn more about the Mark Twain Zephyr is marktwainzephyr.com. And for the Wisconsin Great Northern, spoonertrainride.com. Guys, thank you so much for joining us on the show, Robert and Nick. It's been fantastic to have you share more about what you have going on there. And I think it's safe to say all of us are very excited to buy tickets once things get open again, and especially once you have the Zephyr operational.
Yeah, thank
you for having us.
And now, the question of the day.
Last time on the Roundhouse, we were talking about LARP, live action role play. In particular, one event that occurred for a number of years called Fairweather Manor. This idea of having events where the participants are characters in a world, not just observers, but actual characters, led me to ask you guys, if you could experience a LARP, when and where would you like to set it? From the roundhousepodcast.com, Patrick Thomas Webb writes, I think a LARP on a train would be a lot of fun, perhaps on a streamliner like the Hiawatha, Daylight, etc. To tie it back into a castle, riding to a castle behind a Great Western Railway castle class, while being a bit indulgent for rail fans, would also be a pleasant experience. Dean Musara writes, personally, I would like to experience what Fairweather Manor offered. The time period is interesting to me, and I would set it in my locale. I'm just worried about the political climate it could generate. Interesting concern there, Dean. I think that LARPs, from my research, have in some cases tackled very controversial subjects. The key is that the organizers have an awareness of where there could be either an emotional turmoil, as in the case of Fairweather Manor, with it being set during World War I and what the world was like at that time, or other issues that could come up depending on the subject matter. If it's done right, it's a very interesting way to explore these difficult topics. That said, I think it's a lot of fun by what's been described. I personally would love to have experienced Fairweather Manor. Hopefully somebody picks up the baton where they left off to be able to do a Downton Abbey-inspired LARP in the future. As for doing a railroading LARP, I've been really affected by this idea strongly for quite some time now, ever since I had that conversation last year, and even before then. I'm at this point actively working with a railroad to try to do a LARP for next year, which would be 2022. And at this point, it's just the ideas phases, nothing's committed. But if you want to see it happen and you'd like to learn more about what we're envisioning, please contact me via the roundhousepodcast.com. Your question of the day for this episode is, what is your favorite streamliner? Let me know on the roundhousepodcast.com. We have links to social media there. Thank you guys for tuning in and being part of this show and this experience. There's so much more in store, and it's great to have you along for the ride. Remember that the Roundhouse is our house.